Welcome to the Rum Ration podcast. Before we dive into today's conversation, we're thrilled to welcome a guest who brings both a razor-sharp intellect and a deep operational understanding of Cold War strategy and military history. Dr. Sean M. Maloney is a professor of history at the Royal Military College of Canada, where he has taught in the War Studies Department since 2001. He also served as the official historian for the Canadian Army's operations in Afghanistan and held the position of historian with the Strategic Studies Directorate at the National Defense Headquarters. Dr. Maloney's work is anything but armchair analysis. He's been embedded with Canadian and Allied forces in conflict zones like Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan. And when it comes to the Cold War nuclear strategy, he's one of the best in the business. His books like Learning to Love the Bomb and Emergency War Plan, The American Doomsday Machine, expose the gritty, classified realities behind the myths of deterrence and doctrine. He's also written other books focused on NATO naval preparations at the beginning of the Cold War, so quite well-rounded. And today, we're bringing him on the podcast to help us dig into the Bomarc Missile controversy and to rethink what we thought we knew about the Avro Arrow and Canada's place in the Cold War. Warning, the truth may be unsettling to some of the current elbows-up types that are out there. Dr. Maloney, welcome to the Rum Ration podcast.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to it.
So as I was digging into research for this episode, one thing that really struck me and stuck with me was something that you wrote back in 2014 in the Royal Canadian Air Force Journal. And to me, you summed up the tone around the whole Arrow Bomarc debate quite perfectly. It was this line that you wrote, quote, "Arrow is Canadian, Bomarc is American. Arrow good, Bomarc bad. There is no quarter. The Bomarc had to be bad, so the Arrow can be so good," end quote. And to me, that just nailed it. It captures this, quote, elbows up, all or nothing vibe that still colors how we talk about this stuff today. It's easy to rally around the Arrow and rally around the flag as a symbol, but maybe a little too easy. And I think your work really challenges us to take a harder look at what was actually going on under the surface. So with that in mind, let's start with my first question for you. The, quote, Arrow good, Bomarc bad is the dominant narrative in Canada. Why do you think that dichotomy became so entrenched in the public imagination?
Well, obviously, it appeals to the inherent anti-Americanism that exists in Canada at a low level at the time and over time. One of the most important aspects of this is that the Arrow and Bomarc are conceived as a system along with radar together. They're not considered to be separate from each other. One supports the other. Okay, and that goes back to a study done in 1954 by DRB. And I've written history about this in Learning to Love the Bomb. But the idea that we grew up with the idea that the Bomarc replaced Arrow, and it's not the case. They were always complementary systems. But that was so highly classified at the time, and then nobody bothered to question that narrative for about 20 or 30 years, as people caught up in the emotionalism of the Arrow being cut up, right?
Right.
Its place in the larger system gets overlooked by a lot of people. And remember, we're talking about an air defense system where it is more than the sum of its parts. And the Arrow is only one part of that.
That was very clearly put. And you've argued that the Bulmar Missile has been unfairly maligned. Could you sort of tell us, for those who don't know, a little bit about what Bomarc was and what Canadians specifically misunderstood about the system? Because I have to admit, myself, as we said a little bit earlier on, I tend to be a little more of the patriotic bent then, a little bit of the elbows up aspect of things. And Colin and I have gone back and forth on this a little bit. And going through your article, it just changed my mind completely. It gave me a much deeper and clearer perspective on what was going on at the time.
Okay, so when we're talking about Bomarc, we're talking about an incredibly advanced system for the day, and this is the 50s. You're dealing with a ramjet, you're dealing with a nuclear weapon on board, you're dealing with its interaction with a system called SAGE, which itself is the precursor of the internet because it's interconnected by the telephone system, and you're dealing with really early data movement capabilities. This thing is like way, way, way ahead of its time. Okay, so, and it's conceived as, let's just say, an area system. So you've got a point defense system for a city consisting, say, of Nike Hercules or Nike Ajax. Then you've got the next sort of bound out from that becomes something like Bomarc. And then outside of that, you've got the fighters. So you got a layered air defense for whatever target we're talking about. When we're talking about the 1950s, we have to move away from pinpoint defense of cities because of the immense destructiveness of megaton-yield nuclear weapons, okay? Where these things can leave a crater 500-600 feet deep and lay waste to an area that's about maybe a mile across. So when you're getting into weapons like that, point defense becomes really problematic. So you need something that pushes the envelope away from the defended areas. And the defended areas aren't just cities, which are points on a map basically full of people. You've got entire target systems that the other side's planning on hitting. Air bases, industry, command and control, pretty much everything. So you create a perimeter defense for North America, and then what is the practical limit on doing that up in the north for obvious reasons?
Right.
And then,
Right.
of course, you got to do the same thing. So we're dealing with basically perimeter defense of areas that are considered between Canada and the U.S. to be important in what will be a long-term, a war that will continue for months or years after the nuclear dimension of it. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So makes me kind of giggle when you talk about the different targets that were done both sides. Because when I went to SAJUP at the end of the 80s, so the end of the Cold War, and the SAJUP I was going to, John Abbott College out in the West Island of Montreal, was about 1.5 kilometers, maybe 2 kilometers from Spar Aerospace at the time, who probably was highly targeted by the Soviets. But John Abbott College boldly declared themselves a nuclear weapons-free zone. Yeah, good luck for you. Congratulations.
So did McGill.
Yeah.
So did McGill.
Yeah, there you go. Well done.
I was going to high school in Alberta. It was like, anti-cruise, all that kind of stuff. And it was just like, okay, have fun.
Exactly.
Refinery network and the Mayo Air Base are going to be nailed.
Big targets.
Weapons just to make sure the rubble bounces. So when you're dealing with Bomarc, it's conceived as part of this system. Okay.
That's interesting. I like that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So it's way ahead of its time. But what's really scary and interesting about this is the warhead itself. And I think there are other nuke rivet counters that I know that have tried to drill into this too, and it's been really difficult. When I wrote that piece a while back, I was pushing the limits of the information. And even today, we still do not have a picture of what the W-40 warhead actually looks like, okay? Like, I know where it fits inside the airframe. I've got pictures of the canisters or containers of it showing up at North Bay being delivered, but even today, we still don't know what exactly what it looked like, okay? So think about that.
That's pretty interesting because Canadians weren't allowed to work on it directly, right? As the Americans had the complete isolation on that. Did I understand correctly?
On the base, there's actually a building for maintenance of the warheads. I got into the one up at North Bay and photographed the interior, and they'd left all sorts of stuff on the walls that told me all sorts of things of how the warhead actually worked. But this is the problem with when you're dealing with nuclear history. You've got think concepts and ideas and weapon systems that are still classified from before I was born. Okay, and there's probably good reason for some of this because we don't want other countries reverse engineering some of it. But I tried to figure out what the warhead was about, and that was a journey unto itself because that gives insight into exactly how you're going to employ Bomarc. So the idea that the public has that this is a missile with a nuclear warhead on board, it goes up there, it blows up and destroys the incoming bomber, like through contact or proximity, is only part of the truth, okay? So this particular warhead pumps out what we would call tailored effects. You can partition the energy coming out of the nuke to do specific things. And in this case, I think this one was partitioned to pump out neutrons. And neutrons, of course, in the atmosphere go forever. And that can be used to damage things like nuclear bombs on board bombers. It can be used to fry crews on board bombers, you see? So,
well, then that leads me to my next question. Then, from a military doctrine point of view, then how plausible was it that the Bomarc could have served as a stopgap anti-ballistic missile system as opposed to just for the bombers that it was originally designed for?
Well, that was interesting because I tried to push the limits of the information on that one. Let me back up and explain where that came from. The Soviets developed a Bomarc-like system that we call SA Gamut, okay? And it approximates, it's a Bomarc analog. It has a nuke on board, it's ramjet, it has a ramjet to get it going, and that kind of thing. So U.S. satellites picked these up being built in the 1960s. Now, they've already got like scads of anti-aircraft missiles all over the place. Like I plotted this out on the map of Ukraine for the book I'm doing right now. But the SA-5 systems come up, and the American photo interpreters and analysts are like, okay, is this a SAM, surface-to-air missile to kill bombers, or is it an ABM to kill ballistic missiles? And they can't tell. So they start drilling into this to try and prove it one way or another. And the key thing isn't the missile or the warhead itself, it's the acquisition system to get it to where they think that the target's going to be. And they start looking for a relationship between those sites and the very huge radars they're building around Moscow that watch space. And they tentatively, one group of analysts said there's no connection, and there's another group of analysts says, yes, there is a connection, and they never fully resolve it. So that gave me a few ideas like, okay, let's take a look at this. And sure enough, I'm finding primary stuff that's extremely circumstantial. They wanted to bump the warhead up to probably in the megaton yield range. That would generate a larger kill box up in space, or sorry, above the Earth, let's just say. There's discussions of it being used against missiles coming off of submarines, if they could do that. I found that in some of the papers. And so you take a look at this and like, okay, to the Sage Center, North Bay, and then predict where it could go, that's a question mark. The Soviets couldn't do that very well. Their computing technology wasn't there. Ours could have been. So unless we've got some kind of declassified engagement manual on how to do this, which I haven't found yet, it's going to remain speculative. But the idea that you can detonate a bunch of weapons up there as a sort of last-ditch effort to interfere with an attack, I think that something like that had to have existed. It definitely did on the other side.
It does sound very likely. One of the things that I found really interesting was the subject of secrecy. So the question that I have for you here is, what role did secrecy around nuclear weapons or nuclear weapon effects and ABM systems play in shaping Canadian public debate or in limiting it entirely? Because I found the whole secrecy aspect of it quite interesting.
Well, one of the main issue here is the technology is not ours.
Right.
Let's start with that.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Now this is a bit of a sidebar. It's something else I dug out years ago. We wind up with we would basically borrow them under dual key control. However, I found in the Eisenhower records that the Eisenhower national security policy was that if Canada asked for the weapons themselves, then the U.S. would give them to us as long as we maintain the safety of them. But only if we asked them, and we never did. We never asked them point blank, hey, can we have these? We never thought they would do that. So we came up with this other arrangement that we're more familiar with. So
we're far too polite.
What's that?
We're far too polite.
Well, it is interesting, but the argument that was used by the senior military personnel is if they give them to us, then we'll have to maintain them. That'll cost money.
Well, I think there was something similar for tanks in the 80s. The Americans were going to give us a whole bunch of tanks, and we're like, ooh.
So there's that dimension of it, which is quite interesting. But when you're dealing with the secrecy of nuclear weapons and how they work and what goes into them, I run into that now, even dealing with this period with the work that I do currently. Okay? Like there are things that they do not want out there. And at one point, I thought it was just purely bureaucracy. And then when I started gaining more insight into weapons design, I can sort of see that there's a bit of a problem. So in certain cases, so they just blanket say, do that. So how do you explain to the Canadian public that dimension of things? You don't want to.
You don't want to. Yeah. That makes sense.
Release relationships, those become political footballs. If anything short of we have absolute control becomes a abjuration of sovereignty. That's an absurd argument, but that's a political argument. Okay?
Yes, I can see them playing that. Yeah.
So that becomes an issue, and then the political level just wants to clam up with that. They don't want to deal with that because it's like, okay, that opens a can of worms. And do you really want to talk about the limitations on your release system in the public so the other side knows about it? We're back to the problem of how much public domain discussion should there be versus how much will compromise what we're doing. And again, it's not a new problem in a democracy, right?
So if Canada is being engaged in this anti-ballistic missile detection from the beginning, like they're either as a client or trying to be involved with it themselves, and I guess as NORAD evolved as well. What kind of technological or strategic groundwork was actually being laid at places like Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, which I think most people couldn't find on a map?
That's fascinating. I was writing another piece that wound up in RCAF Journal that dealt with, I took an exercise from like 1961 and converted it into a narrative so people could see how the RCAF viewed how a nuclear war would unfold. And I have other material here as well, but the target list the exercise actually has Prince Albert on it as a primary target. But
interesting.
But what it does is they inverted the grid reference on it, so you couldn't figure it. I had to figure it out when you so Prince Albert becomes like the most vital facility we've got in Canada, essentially at one point. because of the space tracking capability there, right? So then you're into, is it possible to feed data from that into a missile system? I don't know. I don't know if the tech. I don't know if the tech of the day would permit that. That gives us, again, that helps us feed the larger North American aerospace defense system. We're not completely dependent on somebody else's data. We're contributing to the data stream,
Right.
which is what an alliance is all about, right?
Right. Absolutely.
But it's pretty clear that at the time, we thought the Soviets would dump like 2 5-megaton-yield missiles on the thing.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah. So in your view, though, tech of the day, that's a great statement there. Would you say the Bomarc was obsolete before it even got started, or is that just something that politicians like to throw around a little bit, because of the nuclear warhead issue and something?
Oh no! Again, once it's got its nuke on board and everything's all sorted out, the system's fine. Now, obsolete becomes that's always a red flag word, right? Like, what's obsolete?
Yeah, because they were throwing that around a lot, weren't they? But the system's obsolete. So
well, let's take a look at that. So the problem is, what's the Bomarc designed to shoot down, right? Now, then the question becomes, to what extent is there a bomber threat to North America? A. B. How extensive is the threat? Right. Okay. So what happens is, and the other side, this is what I'm working on right now. The other side under Khrushchev wants to downgrade everything except ballistic missiles so they can save money. And so the Soviets wind up in this war, internal debate over force structure that won't be resolved until Khrushchev's removed in 1964. And part of this is it's very public. It's unusually public, which leads me to believe there's a lot of the Soviets are injecting a lot of disinformation into the mix. So they're basically saying all the bombers are going to be scrapped and they're going to cut back on bomber production and they're going to pump out ICBMs. Well, it's a little more complex than that. Yes, they pump out lots of ICBMs, but then they take the existing bomber force. They actually don't cut it as much as we think they do. And then they convert it to do some very interesting things. So you're familiar with a nuclear bomber like Dr. Strangelove. You fly down, you drop the bombs will go off, right? Well, almost the entire Soviet long-range aviation force is converted to standoff missiles. So basically, you got a nuclear weapon on a plane, attached to a plane, and off it goes. And you've got standoff distance between the launching aircraft and the weapon hitting the target. It's like a cruise missile we'd be familiar with today, in effect. So what do? They convert a large number of the bombers to be standoff weapons. And these are huge. I mean, I was looking at the technical aspects of it, and it's bizarre. So it takes like 18 hours to prepare these things. So these are designed for follow-up to the ICBMs. So they're going to disperse all these bombers, load them up in remote locations, align all the things that need to be aligned on board, and then they're going to launch as soon as they are able to do so. Those guys are going to come in behind the ICBM strikes. And so let's just say you got, I don't know, 150 of them, and then they're being accompanied by decoy aircraft that can make it over here in one shot but can't make it back. So you're still going to need something like Bomarc and other forms of interceptors to kill that stuff anyway, regardless of an ICBM strike. Because the ICBM are probably going to be going after U.S. ICBMs. Okay? Again,
so there's always a good use for it. Yeah.
Sorry, say again?
There's always a good use for it, either way.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it can be
being obsolete, no way.
Right.
And by the way, I got a book coming out in the fall called The Cool War, which deals with right now. And the other day there were 2 Bear MSs, which are loaded with cruise missiles.
Yeah.
2 of them are off of Alaska.
Yeah.
Okay? And back in February, they're off of the Canadian ADIZ. So the idea of a plane being a Pez dispenser for cruise missiles isn't
right. You've got a wonderful way with analogies. I like that.
So in terms of obsolete, nah. Now this is where it gets interesting too. When you start seeing, so when is the peak? I think it's around 1968, 69, 70. The other side will start approaching parity in ballistic missiles with the U.S. Once you have, and I can't remember the exact numbers, you're looking at 1,200 to 1,500 ballistic missiles. Once you have that number, then you can afford to expend some on the air defense system. And with Bomarc being in fixed sites, they're vulnerable ultimately to very large megaton yield strikes, okay, which they weren't necessarily earlier on. But once you get there, you got the other side has so many weapons. This is one of the reasons the Ukrainians have mobile air defense systems. They're not nobody fixes their air defense system in place anymore.
Right.
But we still have towed artillery, but we'll wait for another time.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, the horses have been retired, so
That's true. That's true.
it was a great year last year.
So, Professor, how should we interpret the Arrow's cancellation? Was it a betrayal of Canadian innovation, or was it a necessary, if painful, realignment towards continental defense reality?
Okay, so when we look at the reasoning behind it, from what I can tell, let's just dispense with the sort of Bilderberg conspiracy theory nonsense that's still floating around, okay? When the documentation I've seen when I wrote my dissertation, it's a money thing, okay? On one level, it's a money thing. This thing is eating up a lot of dough. It's not very well handled. The project was not managed as effectively as it could have been. And you can point fingers in all sorts of directions for that if you like. So there's that. So it was costing. At the same time, and people don't quite get this, Canadair is building CF-104s, okay?
Right.
What's the CF-104 when we eventually get it? It's used for a nuclear strike in Europe, okay? You're going to load a megaton yield Mark 43 on that and blow away airfields and command centers and missile sites in the Eastern Bloc. So you've got the government funding essentially air defense programs here and nuclear strike programs here. One is in Ontario, the other is in Quebec. So you could play the game of where does Diefenbaker need votes? I don't know if that argument necessarily hold up, but it'd be a fun one to play with. But if they're going to look at what it's going to cost versus what we're going to get out of it, we generate influence with a nuclear strike force in Europe within NATO circles, right? And that's important because NATO is in part used to balance off the Americans. But we also need to have an air defense system, and to what extent does it have to be a purely Canadian system? So you're looking at monetary decisions there that will be part of that decision-making process.
Monetary. So are you saying then it was a monetary decision that was kind of justified, at least certain by the Prime Minister at the time? His justification was that intelligence had changed. And it seems that the various defense chiefs, even and all the various chiefs of staff of the armed services at the time had all agreed with that the threat from the bombers was decreasing.
Well, was decreasing to what, right? And was their information good? So that's the other issue.
So in your opinion, was there any real appetite in the Canadian military establishment of the time for intercepting ICBMs? Or were they looking at it as a what-if scenario type of thing?
No, okay, that's interesting because back then, when you start dealing with ABM type thinking, it goes back into the 50s, and DRB is involved in that. The Americans have a whole series of research programs that are working towards that, which we are actually part of and observing. And then eventually you'll see us get involved in various aspects of it as they're developing their ABM system. So we're watching their ABM system unfold. And then the question that exists is that going to go the distance? And then there is a huge debate, which is, interestingly enough, the Soviets try to influence the debate on ABM in the States. So that system is so intricate and expensive that we decide to contribute to parts of it, not to try and create it on our own, okay? And then watch, under the Trudeau government, Trudeau the first, they watch this debate and they sort of sit it out. And then if it's deployed, it's going to protect us anyway, just because of the nature of the system.
Right.
Okay. And if they don't deploy it, well, then they don't deploy it. So that's why it's bugging me that you got Bomarc sitting in the background and maybe some kind of interim capability if it was upgraded or modified or something like that. But then we're into the debate over how effective is ABM. Okay. It's not a new debate. I mean, you go back and read all the stuff. The arguments are recycled every time ABM becomes BMD, becomes Golden Dome, whatever.
Yeah.
This is a cyclical thing. I wrote a piece on this in Substack if you want to read it.
Okay, I'm looking that up for sure. One thing that struck me, you were talking about before with the Bomarc and the Arrow and everything else being as part of layered systems. In any of your research, have you thought of was it the interceptors that went out first and then the Bomarc would have been fired second in terms of layering?
Yeah, in terms of the engagement sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got the interceptors up as forward as you push them, and they're going to. Okay, so let's back up to the Arrow and its armament itself. And when you drill into this enough, you find out that after they're pursuing a nuclear capability for the Arrow. Okay, again, I'll refer you to a Substack that I wrote on that back in February, where I actually dug out all the records. Somebody was arguing with me about it. I'm like, okay, here you go. But there was Sparrow 3, which was supposed to be nuclear capable, that gets canceled by the U.S. Navy. Right. And then Genie, which we're already familiar with, was supposed to be the nuclear armament for the Arrow in its last iteration. Okay, Falcon is the conventional equivalent, and Falcon's not very good. And the probability to kill is much greater with Genie, which pumps out X-ray plasma and basically fries everything.
That's crazy. And so if you're the air crew on the Arrow and you're part of the further penetration, and then if you're part of the air crew on the interceptors and you're going out first, and then a bunch of Bomarcs are being fired afterwards, how do you get back? You have to fly back through a nuclear field?
Well, it all depends, right? If you're dealing with what's the nature of the attack? Is it single? Is the enemy coming in singly? Is he coming in with an A carrier surrounded by decoys? Okay, then how do you break? Do you break up the formation with like a Genie, right? And then where do you recover?
Okay,
and then you've got that's far forward, and then when you bring it bring it back to where the Bomarc engagement zones are going to be.
It is very case sensitive in that respect, but
yeah,
I can just imagine, regardless, sitting in, I'm thinking, I don't know, did anyone think this part out?
Well, I got a lot of voodoo friends that were voodoo aircrew, and they've walked through with me how they were going to do the engagement, and the survival tactics for the crew and the aircraft. It wasn't really a suicide mission. Okay, and the question then becomes, when you're dealing with by the 1970s, you're dealing a mass ICBM strike in North America. What are you coming back to?
Yeah, fair enough. That's
true. True. That is very true.
The purpose of the exercise, which is deterrence, by presenting. You don't have to have 100% effectiveness of the system. You have to generate enough uncertainty with the Soviets to not do it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So that's when you can't separate NORAD from SAC. They work together. And again, nobody really explained this to the Canadian population ever, from what I can tell.
Well,
so the anti-nuke anti-American people just run rampant because there's nothing countering their information campaign. Oh, and then you start finding interesting stuff out about how our opponents are influencing anti-nuke groups. And so, again, when you're dealing with this kind of Cold War, to focus just on an aircraft and what it can and can't do doesn't help us understand the larger context of the Cold War. That
Come on now, Professor Maloney. Now, next thing you're going to try and tell me is that Canadian universities might have been penetrated by KGB.
Oh, how dare you?
Oh, no,
Impossible.
No. You don't use KGB in Canada. When I was an undergrad, I met a hardcore West German communist who was there to activate the masses at the university I was at. Unfortunately for him, the wall went down and he was out of a job.
Unemployment strikes.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Speaking of the Canadian public, for the average Canadian listener, especially veterans, why does this debate still matter? What lessons do you think that we can draw from the Arrow Bulmar controversy today?
Well, what you're dealing with here, and we'll flip back to what's your view on Canadian nationalism, right? Where do you fit into this?
Yeah.
Do you want to have a sophisticated view of it, or do you want to have an emotional view of it?
That's a very valid question. Yeah.
Okay, so
very valid question.
You have a choice. You have a choice to flip out over this stuff and situate what happened then in today's circumstances, then use this as a vehicle for your political objectives. Yeah, okay, fine. But I'm an historian, and my objective is to explain to you what really happened back then, not shoot it through the lens of what we're doing now necessarily, right? And then people can make up their own mind. I will present convincing argument based on facts and data, but that's where it ends. If people do not accept that, there is nothing I can do about that. Okay, I've run into this with the Arrow before. I was on MCDB Kingston and Glace Bay when they were looking for the models years ago. Now, the tech wasn't that good at the time; it wasn't as good at the time, and the models were found later on. But the people that were on that little cruise were pretty crazy, and it was just wild. And I had to just there was I forgot who it was. There was a videographer there, and he's like, I got to get away. He would go on the smoking deck. I says, I got to get away from these people. They're freaking crazy. And so we would compare notes, and I would just hear this stuff. So one guy would go on and on about the document. I said, well, produce the document. Well, I can't because it's secret. I'm like, well, then why do you have it? Do you have a clearance?
Yes.
Yeah, but you reach the point as a PhD in history At what point am I going to sit there and be an arrogant prick and say you don't fucking know anything because you don't have a PhD? That's not useful either. I could, but why? And okay, if somebody's not receptive to the facts, fuck all I can do about that. I mean, try dealing with UFOs.
That's right.
What was the craziest conspiracy theory you heard about the Arrow?
God, okay. You have to know who the Bilderberg group is first, but it's another one of these secret societies that control. The Bilderbergs were the WEF before the WEF was the WEF. Okay. So Carney would have been at home with the Bilderbergers, or maybe he was. So there's an argument that the Bilderberg group didn't like the Arrow because it was going to compete with European fighter programs, or think that's one of the variants of it. I heard that one. The American corporations, put that in quotation marks. Well, okay, which American quotation? Which American corporations within the quotations, right? Because they don't know. Like Hughes actually helped Avro Canada out. There was a good working relationship there. Hughes wasn't trying to steal anything. He was trying to sell stuff. Mm-hmm. Howard Hughes intersecting with the Avro Arrow. That's another one. I actually looked at all the stuff I could find at the Eisenhower archive. And I found all sorts of wild stuff in there. And you know what?
Oh, I can imagine.
It was like, we love this technology. If we go to war, we're going to buy as many arrows as we can, but we can't do it right now. That kind of stuff. Like there was extreme interest in fostering our industry, not ransacking it. And you can see this in the Eisenhower administration. The relationship with Canada and the U.S. during the Eisenhower administration was incredibly strong, and to the better, I think. And that's all overlooked.
Absolutely.
Deef is this crazed dude who destroyed the Arrow and destroyed Canada. Well, okay, you can't. This is another guy. This is the guy who fought apartheid in South America, right? So, okay, so he's a really bad guy because of the Arrow, but then nobody brings up any of the good stuff that he did. So it's all a question of balance, and it's a question of political narrative, and where do you sit in the political spectrum and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the things I really annoy people with when I point out that Avro wasn't a Canadian company; it was a British company, and 100% owned in the UK, and it was a Canadian subsidiary. Now, all the engineering being done, I can't take away from the accomplishments of the engineering and everything, and the unique Canadian design. But it was a lot of Brits who came over to do that, working for a British company.
Oh yeah. Did you say one of the things you annoy people with?
Well, there's a list. I have a list.
Okay, but we're back. Let's go back. Let's drill into the central problem here. Is why does everybody have their Canadianism in traction all the time? Mm-hmm. Why are people so insecure about it?
Right.
Okay. And nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to go there.
No, everyone gets all quiet when I say define Canadian for me.
Well, then
we had a prime minister in the last 10 years who said that there's no such thing as being a Canadian. I mean, that's
right.
Kind of shocking.
People want to wallow in it. Right. Do you want to wallow in the Avro Arrow being cut up? And so you wind up with this downward spiral of depression all the time about a plane that was cut up back in the late 1950s.
Which, as you pointed out, was standard practice in the industry.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, there's a Brit book I wrote a review on at the same time I wrote those other articles. Where I found, I think, 4 or 5 or 6 programs in the UK where the same thing had happened. Like, this is not unique. But people just really get focused on this.
And they get emotional about it, don't they? I mean, I've come across being in conversations with people, and it was the end all and be all, but of all fighter planes of the time, and it was killed because of the horrible government and many conspiracy theories that went along with it. But yeah, it's very emotional, it seems.
I mean, I'm going to ask a crazy question for you here, Professor Maloney. Do you think because of cost controls and cost overruns on the project, and because I think I read at one point the Avro Arrow program was taking up more than half of the entire defense budget. So I can imagine the Army and Navy weren't terribly pleased about that. Do you think that would have led eventually to justification for unification of the armed forces?
Oh, I'm not going to connect the two of those. Unification is a whole other issue. I actually lecture. I have a course called Canadian Forces Operations 1960 to present, where I have to explain unification to my cadets, right? Because they don't know what it is. I don't think the mismanagement of Arrow deliberately plays in the Glasgow Commission. I think there are other things that are going on, but I wouldn't rule out that it was a factor in this reassessment of how we went about doing defense back then.
It was only a few years prior, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Dr. Maloney, anything else? Any last words you'd like to share about the Arrow or the Bomarc and the Bomarc's role in allegedly killing off the Arrow?
I think we, again, once move away from the emotional nationalism, stop getting upset about it. And if you really want to, again, if you really want to understand it, if you want to get upset, go get upset, fine, go ahead. But if you really want to understand what was going on, you really have to put these things in several wider contexts of the period and not get caught up in simplistic reasons for these things. And in fact, the work I'm doing right now on the Soviet nuclear stuff, it actually provides better context to the problem. There was a threat. They were going to do bad things to us. We had to deter them. This is part of the deterrence system. And I think that once people get a grip on that, rather than focusing just on the plane itself and what happened to it, again, if you want to understand what happened versus just want to fulminate, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Well, Dr. Maloney, thanks so much for joining us today. Your work's been instrumental in challenging some long-held assumptions and helping us, all of us, understand that the Arrow-Bomarc debate wasn't just about machines. It was about politics. It was about perception, and it was about Canada's place in the Cold War world.
Absolutely. It's far deeper than anyone would have imagined or thought about. And we really appreciate the clarity that you brought to such a charged topic. And for our listeners, we'll link to your articles in the show notes. And well, we definitely recommend diving into your books, especially Learning to Love the Bomb and Emergency War Plan, which I think are brilliantly titled. That alone what makes me want to pick up the book and start going through it. So, and you really explain how you can go about understanding Cold War strategy and how that really worked. Because I think in this day and age, now that the Cold War is so far behind us, people have lost sight of what it was really all about and what was going on during those days.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks again for taking the time and for helping us cut through the mythology with some much needed context. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
It just let's everybody keep this in mind too. History's evolutionary, so there's always going to be new stuff coming out. It never actually dead ends. And
absolutely.
What I've come up with takes it one direction. Maybe somebody comes up with something new and takes it another direction. I mean, that's what this is about. The idea that there's one guy who sort of has all the grip on knowledge is sort of wrong. I'm part of this trajectory of understanding the subject. So I'd encourage other people to drill into it and learn for themselves on this.
Very well said.
Great. Thank you.